I'm Laurel, and I made this.
This is the Art Gallery Fabric Equilateral pattern, and you can get it free from their website. And I kind of use this as a base for the quilt I was going to make. The only instructions that I actually followed was using the pattern of the triangle. I didn't use the fabrics recommended. I didn't even use Art Gallery fabrics. I really like how all of these fabrics go together with the gray and the purple. I'm super in love with this marble fabric. I just think it's so pretty. Normally I wouldn't pre-wash fabric for a quilt, but because the purple fabrics are so dark and so close to red, I didn't want them to bleed all over the light gray ones. But that meant I had to cut off these frayed ends before I could get started cutting everything else. To get all this fabric cut out really quickly, I needed to batch cut it, which meant cut all the same one thing and then all the same of the other thing. So I had to figure out how tall I wanted to cut these strips so I could quickly chop out all of these triangles. Now I have to cut that marble fabric that I love so much.
I'm so scared.
I didn't know how much I actually needed because I didn't follow the instructions. The instructions said to cut out like 70 gray triangles, so that took a while. Well, I say gray. They said white. That's a lot of triangles. With all the best intentions to try to at least get the values right, I labeled all of my fabric so I can try and follow the order they laid out in the instructions. So after one, I decided to just do the Laurel thing and wing it, because sometimes I have way too much confidence in myself. Oh, and in case you didn't know, cats love quilts. So grab and sew. Grab and sew. I also wanted to add this angled separation between the purple and the gray, so that added yet another layer of complexity. After the first few rows, I realized that I needed to actually look at the rows in conjunction with each other to make sure that purple area slant was right, because I wasn't paying attention in the beginning, so I had triangles facing all the wrong direction. I had to unpick all these random parts of rows and then try to put them together right again. Time to invite my dear friend Mr. Seam Ripper. He's going to be hanging out for a while. I think I have him looking good now. I think. So when I redid these rows, I ended up having to piece together sections from the failed rows that I did before that I unpicked. So this time I was smart and I kept out the row that sits above the one I was working on. That way I could make sure that it looked good with the one above it. Then I had to sew them together again. A lot of this is repetitive. I tried as hard as I could to make sure that I sewed all the right sides together, but I flippin' knew this was gonna happen. And of course, when I went to do it again, I did the same thing. So here, I'm being smart and I'm flipping the fabric back and forth to make sure that, yes, indeed, this is the right direction, because I'm a thinker. I finally got all the rows done and laid them out together, and then realized that, well, I wasn't happy with the way they looked at all. Somewhere along the line, the rows even somehow grew extra triangles, so I had to go through and, you guessed it, unpick a bunch of stuff all over again. Moral of the story, don't just lay out a row based on the one above it, but look at the whole thing as you put it together. Finally, things are where I want them to be, and I can sew all the rows together. To try and get all the triangles to line up, I pinned each one at the point of the triangles, and you can see I tried to do this by pinning through the seams at the points, that way they wouldn't move around when I sewed them together. I didn't have any video of me sewing these long strips together, so here's just a random shot of me sewing and a cute cat butt. You can see here that sometimes the parts just don't hit at the right spot and some of the points aren't very pointy, but you know what? It's handmade with love, so I'm cool with letting that one fly. Now that it's all together, all I have to do is trim it down into a rectangle. And finally, all the piecework's done. You can see the cool division of color here, and it doesn't look half bad, and I'm way happier with the way this looks versus when I laid it out the first time. To get the quilt ready to be quilted, I had to sew together the backing. I basically ripped the yardage in half, and since it was so much larger than the finished quilt, I just stitched it down the middle and trimmed the seam allowance. Next, I had to baste together the batting, the backing, and the quilt top. I did this utilizing spray glue and safety pins. Basically, you tape down the backing, spray some glue, then lay out the batting trying to get it as smooth as possible because no one wants a lumpy quilt. Well, then you lay out the top trying to get it as smooth as possible, except instead of glue, you hold this down with a bunch of safety pins. I mean, you could do hand basting for stitches, but I don't have the patience or the time for that stuff. And my table was too small to do this all at once, so I had to roll it up and do it in sections. But once it was all basted, I got to trim off enough fabric so it was actually manageable to handle. Now finally, halfway through the video, I can start the actual quilting part. So I started by stitching down one of the sides of the triangles at the angle from corner to corner. After about 3 rows in though, I realized that the thread I was using was way too dark for the top. So I swapped it with a lighter gray. Problem was, I had to unpick and redo those rows. Surprise! Now that the first part of the quilting's done, I can go ahead and figure out where I want to put the in-between lines. At first I started doing it with tape, and then I had a stroke of genius and I went, hey, I'm going to use this cool button placement guide thingy that I have, and that worked like a charm. Once I took it over to the sewing machine and I put my seam allowance guide that came with my machine on there, I realized that it didn't work with the foot I was using and I wasn't willing to change it. So at first I thought I put it on wrong, so I flipped through the manual. Then I saw that it couldn't be used with that foot, so I looked online to see if there was a guide that I could use with that foot, and there wasn't. But because I had ingenuity, I made my own seam guide out of this piece of paper. Here you can see the lines that make up half the pattern that I was putting on the quilt. Well, now that that was done, I could go ahead and do the same thing in the other direction. So I did the outside of the big triangles and then the middle ones. Don't let the time lapse fool you. It took a long time, and manhandling that huge chunk of fabric is exhausting. By the end, my shoulders were super sore. And this is what the final diamond quilt pattern looks like. I mean, it's not super fancy like a lot of the stuff you see, but I really wanted something basic and geometric to go with the triangle design. You know, not too floofy. Quilting, apparently, can distort the fabric piece, so you've got to trim it down and square it up to make sure that it's straight in all directions. That way, when you're done, you've got a quilt that's straight in all directions. There's only one major thing left to do on this quilt, and that's to make the binding. I'm getting so close! To make things extra difficult, I decided to two-tone the binding, so the purple side had the purple binding and the gray side had, well, the gray binding. So I cut the strips and stitched them into a long piece. And then I threaded them through this binder folding doohickey, and then I could press it to have a buttload of binding. Because of the two colors, I had to be extra careful, and dang it, I sewed the binding together backwards. Well, we'll just say that I did that on purpose. Now normally when you're binding a quilt, you would kind of start in the middle of one side and just work your way around in one direction. But because I'm doing the two-tone colors, I have to start in the middle and then work my way around and meet in the middle at the other side, which meant I had to sew in one direction and then I had to go back to that middle point and sew in the other direction. And this made this infinitely more complicated. At the corners, you have to do some magical origami folding, so when you turn it around to the other side, well, you'll see that later. At the end, I had to leave some extra loose so I could stitch the ends together at that purple spot. And when I did it backwards. And then I did it backwards again. And then I did it backwards again. And then it didn't quite line up right in the right direction across the purple, but you know what? We'll just say I meant to do that. I flipped the binding over and held it in place with these awesome clips made just for this kind of thing. Now, Laurel, you might say, why didn't you press that? Well, I didn't press it because I didn't need to. Now here you can see why I did that crazy corner origami. It makes this perfect little mitered corner, like magic. Oh no, Laurel, you ran out of clips. Don't worry, I have a bunch more where that came from. So that means I can go ahead and finish clipping all the way around. And now it's time to stitch the top of the binding. We're so close, you can almost taste it. And here I am, after stitching that gray around, going back and marking all these little spots that I either missed the binding completely or it was too close to the edge, and I didn't want that thing falling apart in the wash, so I unstitched it and then fixed those little sections. And then all I had to do was change to a purple thread and top stitch the last little part, and I'm done! Yeah! Done! Now what did I tell you? Cats love quilts apparently. It's like they couldn't wait for me to be done with it so they could just snuggle up in it. I am beyond thrilled with how good this turned out. I haven't always had the best luck with quilts in the past, and it came together really quick. I got it done in like a week. I love it because it looks so modern and sleek and perfect for the person I made it for. All of that rearranging and unpicking was totally worth it in the end. Now I'm super goopy about quilts. I love the quilts people have made me, and I think they're labors of love that should really be treasured by the people that get them. So what do you think about how this quilt turned out? Have you ever made a quilt before? Let me know down in the comments. I made this as a gift for somebody really special to me, and I hope they love it. Well, actually, I gave it to them already, so I know they do. Now I just need to figure out what to do with all these leftover triangles. And here's a normal like and subscribe part of the video, so you know, you could like or subscribe if you'd like to see me make more stuff. Well, thanks for watching. Bye!